Finding herself inexplicably in a dark, dead forest, the bewildered woman frantically wonders where she is. She tries to make sense of her surroundings, recalling she should have been standing right in front of the station just moments ago. She remembers she was merely on her way back from yet another grueling company recruitment interview. Her mind flashes back to a smug interviewer derisively calling her stiff-headed and too serious. Riding the crowded train, she had frustratingly reflected on applying to dozens of companies, and always failing after the second or third rounds despite turning down those that asked insulting questions. Walking dejectedly past a city fountain, she had lamented her awful day and her inability to ever reach a final interview. Completely exhausted, she had slumped against the fountain's edge to rest for just a little bit before finally heading home. Slipping backward, she suddenly opened her eyes to find herself inexplicably and entirely submerged underwater. Thrashing wildly in the unexpected depths, she desperately grabbed onto the nearest solid edge to pull herself to safety. Hauling herself out of the water, she shivers in the sudden snow and realizes the fountain is no longer made of concrete. Looking down at the strange glowing patterns beneath her, she shockingly wonders if she is sitting in the middle of a magic circle. Two elaborately dressed men loom over her, with the blonde one casually sighing that he never gets used to this bizarre feeling. She stares up at the two mysterious figures in absolute stunned silence. The dark-haired man watching her as if viewing a fairy tale grimly mutters that his burden would have been lighter had he just arrived later. As the blonde teases his companion for being bad with words, the girl is startled to realize she can perfectly understand their meaning despite the foreign language. The blonde cheerfully introduces himself as Ludwig Kleinbeck, Lord of the Venus Territory in the Kingdom of Abend, leaving her utterly bewildered. Trembling before the strange men, she finally manages to stammer out a plea asking exactly where this place is. Looking closely at her, the dark-haired man confirms to Ludwig that there is absolutely no mistake and she is indeed a traveler. Moving gently, he kneels beside her and wraps his heavy cloak around her shivering shoulders while speaking in a low, soft voice that seems to melt into the night air. Closing her eyes as the immediate heat envelopes her, she softly thanks him for the sudden comforting warmth. A sudden burst of magical energy abruptly swirls around them, sending her hair and clothes fluttering wildly. She snaps her eyes open in sheer surprise, realizing that the wind gusting around her is actually incredibly warm. Touching her clothes in disbelief, she is utterly shocked to find that the magical breeze has completely dried her off in an instant. Gesturing to his quiet companion, Ludwig introduces the dark-haired man as Emery Rosenstiel. Still struggling to process the impossible situation, she nervously stammers that she was just supposed to be at the train station. Looking down at her with a serious expression, Ludwig bluntly informs her that she has somehow come from a completely different world. He calmly explains that they only came to this spot because they saw a massive pillar of light suddenly rise in the middle of the forest. She tries to nervously joke it off as a lie, but the undeniably bizarre reality of her surroundings makes it impossible to deny. Trembling with an overwhelming mix of fear and confusion, the ordinary Japanese university student realizes the terrifying truth as her voice breaks. Standing before Ludwig and Emery under the strange moon, the impossible reality of her new life finally begins to sink in. Shocked by the realization that she can never return home, her heart pounds as Emery asks about the parents she will never see again. Ludwig looks at her with pity and gently explains that people like her are unfortunately known as travelers. The devastating truth sets in as he reveals there is absolutely no record of a traveler ever returning to their original world. Spiraling into panic, she stammers in disbelief, realizing she hasn't even graduated university or gotten a job offer yet. Her mind races with trivial regrets, remembering the messy one-room apartment she rushed out of and the food she left behind. Tears threaten to spill as she realizes she was never a good daughter, leaving behind nothing but unfinished business and parents who will only worry about their last phone call. Surprised by a sudden warmth, she looks up to find the expressionless Emery gently patting her head, wondering if he is actually worried about her. Kneeling beside her in the snow, Emery softly promises that he and Ludwig will become her new family in this strange world. Ludwig cheerfully chimes in, boasting that as a lord he welcomes more travelers settling in his territory because it adds prestige. Emery's gaze softens as he vows to teach her their customs and help her find a secure way to live in this new reality. Overwhelmed but seeing a glimmer of hope, she nervously adjusts her hair and begins to accept their offer. Deciding that securing her survival is the priority, she gratefully tells the Lord and the professor that she would deeply appreciate their help. Offering his hand with a gentle expression, Emery warmly asks the mysterious traveler to finally tell them her name. Reaching out to grasp his hand, she introduces herself as Shinobu, feeling the sudden reality of physical contact. She notes that despite his inhumanly beautiful looks, Emery's hand is surprisingly firm, warm, and dry as he repeats her name. Smiling faintly beneath the moonlight, Emery holds her hands and promises to help her live in this world. Staring up at her magical savior, Shinobu is left completely breathless by his ethereal and striking beauty. Looking back on that moment, she reflects that there was never a time in her life when she could purely trust people. Now dressed in an academic uniform half a year later, she mentally writes to her mother about her new life in another world. Despite the passage of time, she admits she is still having a very hard time distinguishing right from left in this strange place compared to her intense job-hunting days. Walking through the stone halls of the Royal Academy in the northern kingdom of Aben, she notes the irony of finding work as an office clerk here after failing to get a job offer back home. Pausing before a set of grand doors, a wry smile crosses her face as she wonders if her grueling job hunt is truly over. Startled by a sudden outburst, she peeks into the office to see trembling colleagues reacting to a harsh critique. Sitting behind a massive desk scattered with papers, Emery Rosenstiel, the first person she met in this world, looks on with an imposing aura. She observes his strikingly long limbs, his perfectly doll-like face with black-rimmed hair, and his deep blue eyes shining like gemstones. Now known as the master of spell construction and a highly specialized professor, Emery gestures dismissively while asking a student what is lacking in their work. With his profile perfectly framed, Emery sharply remarks that the spell is full of flaws, his smooth voice making the harsh words cut even deeper. Standing stiffly by the door, Shinobu listens to Emery brutally tear apart the report for having too many typos, bad word order, rambling sentences, and being a total waste of time compared to deciphering ancient spellbooks. Handing down his final verdict, Emery coldly demands the student rewrite the flawed sections by tomorrow, sparking panic across the room as Shinobu realizes this is a normal day at the Royal Academy. Unfazed by their impossible timeline, Emery aggressively scolds the complaining student, ordering them to stop whining and get to work immediately. Overhearing gossiping students label someone their age a demon, the young clerk pauses in surprise while holding her documents. Startled by the intimidating Professor Rosenstiel suddenly looming over her, she nervously stammers out a greeting. Clutching her paperwork tightly, she presents her application to borrow the practical training hall and politely requests his review. The professor coldly rebukes her, stating the simple task should have been completed yesterday as he originally requested. Wilting under his harsh critique that her hesitation was pointless, the inexperienced clerk frantically apologizes for wanting her work double-checked. Despite his abrasive demeanor, she cannot help but marvel at his staggering efficiency and painting-like beauty. She quickly realizes that his striking looks have become intensely irritating, proving that a pretty face loses its charm in mere days. Promising to work faster next time, she secretly wonders if the gentle savior from her first night was merely a fleeting illusion. Unmoved by her promises, the stern professor declares that extra effort is completely meaningless if it fails to produce tangible results. Mentally cursing his uncute personality, she turns to excuse herself only to be abruptly halted by his sharp command. To her utter confusion, he declares that she must learn the fundamentals of magic alongside her reading and writing lessons. The gloomy professor clumsily demands that as a traveler she must master magic to become a useful asset to the territory rather than hiding inside the academy. Conjuring a delicate glowing orb, he arrogantly proclaims himself the most suitable instructor for complex magical control, filling her with immediate dread. Looming closer, the professor drops the bombshell that he intends to tutor her personally. Recoiling in absolute horror, she loudly rejects his offer without a second thought. Shocked by her own brutally honest outburst, she scrambles for an excuse as the professor glares down at her. Waving her hands frantically, she attempts to backtrack by citing his incredibly busy schedule as a reason to decline his tutoring. Undeterred, Rosenstiel insists it is absolutely urgent for magic-rich travelers like her to hone their abilities immediately. Desperately deflecting, she argues that anyone else could teach her and proudly claims she already secured Ludwig's approval for an alternative arrangement. Ignoring his imposing will, she subtly spots the door and plots a swift escape route from the suffocating conversation. Puffing out her chest, she boldly declares that she is the type of student who only grows when showered with praise. Yelling that his constant scolding would prevent her from learning anything, she spins on her heel and bolts for the exit. Sprinting down the hallway in blind defiance, she violently crashes into another person and tumbles to the hard stone floor. Rubbing her bruised head, she freezes as a harsh, instantly recognizable voice berates her severe lack of proper upbringing. An aggressive maid scolds the fallen clerk, demanding to know why she is still lingering and batting her eyelashes at the professor. Baffled by the accusation of flirting, the grounded clerk realizes her aggressive attacker Olivier is actually a fiercely protective lady's maid. A gentle voice commands the furious maid to stop, prompting the clerk to look up at the stunning noblewoman Olivier serves. Ignoring her maid's frantic protests, the elegant lady graciously kneels to help gather the scattered application papers. Handing back the documents, the radiant woman softly asks if she is all right, leaving the clerk completely spellbound. Staring in awe, the clerk finally realizes she is face to face with the infamous Professor Rosenstiel's beautiful fiancée. A close-up reveals pale green eyes framed by long lashes as silver hair catches the sunlight and spreads softly like rippling waves while she blinks adorably. Gazing at this impossibly perfect beauty, who could easily be mistaken for a fairy, Shinobu is interrupted when the girl gently asks if she is hurt. Shinobu nervously stammers out her thanks and confirms she is fine, prompting the beautiful girl to smile and express her relief. Flashing a dazzling ethereal smile, the silver-haired girl thanks Shinobu for her hard work today and gently warns her to be careful walking from now on. Blushing furiously under the girl's gaze, Shinobu absent-mindedly agrees, while internally marveling at how she keeps meeting an unusual number of beautiful people since arriving in this world. Watching the stunning girl stand alongside her equally striking maid, Shinobu reflects that just existing near her makes the very air feel miraculously purified. Gently reprimanding her aggressive maid, the beautiful lady tells Olivier to stop while the fiercely loyal servant loudly insists that her mistress is far too kind. Trying to maintain professional boundaries, Shinobu stammers that their relationship does not go beyond work and awkwardly attempts to change the subject to the professor. Recalling a gloomy, nagging, and undeniably sinister dark-haired professor, who she has repeatedly rejected, Shinobu mentally groans that she would honestly pass on dealing with him. A sudden sharp gasp abruptly breaks Shinobu's train of thought. The lady sharply orders Olivier to know her place just as the hostile maid fiercely declares that Shinobu doesn't stand a chance with her mistress. Realizing the time, the lady casually pivots and announces they must go because the professor is waiting, leaving Shinobu slightly stunned as they sweep down the hall. Dropping her shoulders in pure exhaustion, Shinobu mentally groans and wonders why today is just one stressful thing after another. Marching purposefully down a grand stone staircase, Shinobu notes that the prestigious Royal Academy of Abend was established in the northernmost territory of Venus to gather talented youths and protect the border. Passing an ornate candlelit statue, she observes the massive scale of the academy, where both students and professors live. Looking over a balcony into a breathtaking multi-tiered library, she takes in the staggering scope of the ceremonial halls. The sprawling campus also includes a massive dining hall, a serene chapel, and multiple sunlit courtyards for the students to enjoy. Gazing out at the towering skyline, Shinobu distinguishes between the majestic castle where night trainees study and the looming structure specifically designated as the Tower for mage trainees. She explains that the upper floors of the tower contain professors' laboratories and residences which continuously grow strange new spires, while the lower levels house lecture and practical training halls. Reaching the ground floor, she enters the bustling administrative building located at the very base of the tower where she currently works as a clerk. Shinobu notes the administrative split, pointing out that the castle side handles the night department clerks while the tower side manages the magic department. Although there is no explicit physical boundary between the two departments, the stark contrast in their atmospheres makes the division obvious at a single glance. Looking from the bright, pristine night department side to the shadowy, cluttered magic department side, the atmospheric difference is undeniably dramatic. Glancing around suspiciously, Shinobu shrewdly wonders if the magic department is intentionally being pushed aside by the administration. She notes that the tower is suspiciously located at the absolute farthest back of the campus on the north side, suffering from notably poor sunlight. Slapping her cheeks to pull herself together, she admits that despite the shadows, she still ends up staring in absolute awe every time she walks through the administrative building. Striding down a massive vaulted corridor, she realizes that the impossibly huge interior must be the result of space expansion magic, since the building doesn't look nearly this spacious from the outside. She maps out the various divisions further inside, listing academic affairs, student affairs, human resources, admissions, and finally her own assistant division which manages lecture halls. Smiling softly to herself, Shinobu admits that even though she just started working recently and doesn't fully understand all the divisions yet, she still genuinely likes the magnificent sight of her new workplace. Hoisting a heavy stack of mysterious equipment with a final heave, she announces her return and is warmly welcomed back as Shinobu-san by her colleague. A cheerful young man brightly welcomes Shinobu back to the office as she carries a stack of papers. Slamming her documents down in frustration, Shinobu desperately demands that her senior mentor Theo listen to her complaints. She vents that she absolutely cannot get along with that professor, while noting that Theo is an intellectual-looking man with a blunt nose who serves as her senior mentor. Theo mildly defends the professor's harsh criticism about effort being meaningless without results, but Shinobu angrily counters that the man nitpicks every little thing. Leaning back with a grin, Julian points out that they get arrogant but incompetent students every year, just like a lazy merchant's son from his own class who couldn't even graduate. She observes that the flashy but surprisingly capable Julian is close to her age and is merely working there to gain experience before taking over his family's business. Julian laughs and praises Shinobu as admirable for actually putting in the effort, unlike the lazy student he just mentioned. Theo chimes in with a gentle smile, admitting he initially thought she would slow them down, but is genuinely impressed she has hung in there for half a year. Despite their praise, Shinobu feels an unsettling disconnect, reflecting on how people from her world are revered as Risend, or travelers. She notes that past travelers believed to be invited by the goddess left behind significant technologies like papermaking, printing, and plumbing, allowing her to feel traces of her old world. Because travelers bring blessings to daily life, many citizens in the Kingdom of Abend strongly believe that supporting them benefits the entire nation. Protected travelers are encouraged to either study or work after learning the basics, which is why she began working as a clerk. Hoping to eventually be taught magic, Shinobu nervously asks her colleagues if the imposing Professor Rosenstiel is always so harsh. She mimics Emery's cold tone, recalling how he utterly destroyed a student earlier by claiming deciphering ancient spellbooks would be more meaningful than reading their report. Using a casual wind spell to dry his ink, Theo agrees that the professor's ruthless attitude makes him very unpopular with the nobles despite his solid lectures. Leaning on a stack of books, Julian jumps in to add that Professor Rosenstiel is the subject of countless wild rumors and legends. The rumors include kicking out students he disliked immediately after taking his post and furiously yelling at clerks for entering his lab carelessly. Julian notes that the nobility clearly despises him and asks if it's true that the professor is genuinely dangerous when he finally snaps. Terrified by the thought, Shinobu points out that Emery is always snapping and dreads to think what getting worse would even look like. Theo smoothly deflects by stating that many mages are naturally temperamental, prompting Julian to laugh and call out Theo's own recent outburst. Julian playfully exposes that Theo himself got furious at the professor's unreasonable demands just the other day and storms straight into his lab. Adjusting his glasses menacingly, Theo darkens as he remembers Emery demanding the purchase of individual quill pens for every single student. He fiercely reminds them that quill pens are strictly an individual expense for non-scholarship students, infuriated by Emery's blatant disregard for basic regulations. Recalling the confrontation, she pictures Professor Rosenstiel ignoring her entirely while reading, clearly possessing zero intention of remembering anything unrelated to magic. Since Emery isn't a pure academy graduate and grew up as a noble, he completely ignores budget limits, leaving the poor clerks to get scolded for any wasted money. Shinobu nervously adds that from an administrative standpoint, Emery is a nightmare to deal with because he refuses to follow regulations or socialize with other professors. Theo suddenly turns his terrifying glare toward a trembling Shinobu and warns her that this administrative nightmare concerns her directly. The usually gentle Theo becomes terrifyingly empty as he drops the bombshell that when Professor Rosenstiel goes out of control, she will be the one responsible. Projecting an aura of true darkness, Theo mercilessly informs Shinobu that she is now officially in charge of managing that black demon. Crushed under the weight of this impossible task, Shinobu visualizes Emery looking down at her haughtily, while Theo coldly orders her to do her best to manage him properly. Pushed into a corner, Shinobu forces a nervous smile and stammers that she will do her best, while Julian cheerfully nods along beside her. Carrying her lunch tray outside, Shinobu happily notes that despite her daily hardships, she managed to arrive early and is slowly getting along with the familiar faces of the students. Smiling softly to herself, she reminisces about her university days in Japan and wonders if she acted the same way back then. Two students kindly offer her their seats at a table since they are just about to leave. Acknowledging that sharing a table can be awkward, she gratefully accepts their offer as a rewarding treat and thanks them politely. Sitting down with her meal, she enthusiastically declares her intent to dig into the delicious-looking food. She picks up a piece of meat from her tray, eager to taste the hearty set meal of stewed beef, vegetables, and bread. Savoring the deeply satisfying flavors of the tender falling-apart meat and savory vegetable broth, she realizes her initial worries about this world's food were unfounded, lamenting only the lack of white rice. Chewing happily on the delicious stew, she eagerly scoops up a spoonful of vegetables for her next bite. Her peaceful lunch is abruptly interrupted when the flashy Julian spots her and casually calls out her name. Startling her so badly, she nearly drops her spoon. Julian cheerfully leans over and asks if he can share her table. Before the flustered Shinobu can even agree, Julian smoothly takes a seat and thanks her for saving him a spot. Glancing nervously around the shaded dining area filled mostly with magic course students, Shinobu asks Julian if seating is rigidly segregated by department, noting the commerce students prefer the sun, while the knights dominate the building side. Gesturing with his spoon, Julian casually explains that the segregated seating arrangement is an unspoken rule among the student body. He elaborates that the high-tuition night course students act like they own the best spots because they are the academy stars, while the commerce course handles all the flashy festival-like events. When Shinobu curiously asks about the magic course's reputation, Julian vaguely hints that they are far from popular or lively. Dropping his cheerful demeanor, Julian bluntly confesses that the magic department is notoriously dark and gloomy. Taking a bite of her bread, Shinobu sweat drops and silently agrees, reflecting on how unnervingly quiet the magic students usually are. She wonders aloud why they always wear pitch-black robes instead of something a bit flashier. Julian points out that beyond using simple magic to dry ink and clothes, the nature of magic itself dictates their dreary aesthetic. Shinobu shudders in agreement, recalling the creepy, incomprehensible advanced magic rituals, weird dances, and rumbling noises they produce. Julian summarizes that to the rest of the academy, the magic course is simply viewed as a depressing gathering of gloomy people. As they eat, Julian's talkative nature results in Shinobu listening to a barrage of wild rumors about the magic course, including terrifying screams echoing from the practice rooms. Julian gossips that while the harmless astrology professor is over 100 years old, the other elderly magic professors frequently engage in violent bet-fueled duels that leave spectators questioning if the losers are still breathing. Julian declares that they are all complete oddballs, singling out the nagging Professor Rosenstiel as an especially intense and terrifying figure. Later, inside the Grand Academy Library, Shinobu stares in shock as the librarian informs her that no books are allowed to be removed from the premises. The librarian politely explains that the specific texts Shinobu needs are kingdom-designated important books meant solely for in-class reference. Apologizing for the strict rules, the librarian notes that while ordinary books can be borrowed, these rare volumes must stay firmly within the library walls. Frantically realizing there are no copiers in this world, Shinobu bites her nail in panic, wondering how she will ever find the time to hand copy the massive texts. Her internal crisis is suddenly interrupted by the handsome, spectacled Gillis, who smoothly approaches the desk and remarks on the sheer coincidence of running into her. Harold Gillis, a magic course student, stands out as the only handsome guy in his department, rivaling even the popular night course in looks. Exuding a calm and gentle intellectual beauty that sharply contrasts with the rough nights, he easily makes Shinobu understand why the girls are constantly screaming over him. When Harold explains he came on an errand for the professor but found a book that cannot be taken out, Shinobu immediately grasps the problem. He helpfully suggests that she should just have a magical copy made, leaving Shinobu slightly confused by the concept. Realizing that this world lacks a physical copier but possesses convenient copy magic, Shinobu marvels at the familiar yet magical solution. Harold notes she is lucky to find a mage who can still make copies today, as everyone usually runs out of mana right before report deadlines. Handing over a piece of paper, a clerk firmly instructs the startled Shinobu to fill out a form if she wants the copies made. Panic sets in when the clerk asks her to specify the page numbers, as Shinobu realizes the professor entirely forgot to list them. Stepping in to save the day, Harold effortlessly points out that the required information is actually written right on the back of the list. Easily lifting the massive stack of heavy books to help her, Harold accepts her relieved gratitude for saving her from the professor's inevitable scolding. As they walk, Shinobu gratefully reflects that Harold Gillis, who takes Professor Rosensteel's lectures frequently, goes out of his way to look after a stranded traveler like her. Appreciating his smooth consideration in carrying the load while leaving just one book for her, so she couldn't refuse his help, she agrees when he sympathetically remarks on her difficult daily life. Despite the constant hardships, Shinobu smiles brightly and admits that her new life is actually surprisingly fun. Harold looks back at her with genuine surprise, clearly caught off guard by her positive declaration. Touching her cheek with a warm smile, she explains that even though she gets scolded constantly and faces a world full of unknowns, the thrill of discovery makes it all deeply enjoyable. Walking beside him down the grand hallway, she optimistically declares that not understanding simply means she has endless opportunities to grow and learn. Harold looks at her with a soft, understanding smile just as she respectfully knocks on the heavy wooden door to the professor's office. Inside the sunlit office, the dark-haired Professor Rosensteel leans back casually at his massive desk, surrounded by esoteric magical charts and chalkboards. Without missing a beat, the imposing professor immediately barks out a complex new order to arrange the books chronologically using memo pages as bookmarks. As Shinobu freezes in despair at the massive pile of work, Harold smoothly steps in to split the daunting task, leaving her immensely relieved. Sorting through the towering stack of documents, Harold flashes a reassuring smile and notes that this kind of tedious work goes much faster with an experienced helper. Blindingly overwhelmed by his casual kindness and handsome halo effect, Shinobu gratefully thanks him while they work side by side. As they quickly clip memos to the pages, Shinobu explains that her old world also had a place very similar to this academy, which was called a university. When Harold curiously asks if a university isn't strictly a place for studying, Shinobu sheepishly admits that she mostly just spent her time playing around. Sweating nervously under his baffled gaze, she realizes just how incredibly difficult it is to explain the concept of modern club activities to someone from a magical fantasy world. She eagerly describes how university students gather with like-minded peers for diverse extracurriculars ranging from sports and rock bands to literature and art recitals. Flipping through another book, she warmly adds that universities also hosted massive, lively school festivals. She vividly recalls the festivals as bustling events filled with food stalls where outsiders and prospective students could freely explore the usually closed campus to experience the vibrant student life. Remembering the exciting plays and performances, Shinobu suddenly cheers in triumph as they finally finish sorting the massive, exhausting pile of books. Startled by her lively description of the school festival, Harold suddenly leans in close and intensely grabs her hands, passionately exclaiming that her idea is exactly what they need. A blonde-haired man with glasses brightly exclaims that it is time for the school festival. Startled by his sudden enthusiasm, Shinobu nervously stammers out Gillis' name. Realizing he leaned in too close, Gillis steps back and apologizes before asking if something happened regarding the school festival. He calmly explains that a school festival is an event to help outsiders understand what happens inside a closed space, just as Shinobu had mentioned earlier. Placing his hand on a thick book, Gillis notes that the magic course hasn't been popular for the past few years. He explains that because basic magic can be learned privately, people question the point of learning advanced magic at the academy. Shinobu realizes the unfortunate truth as Gillis adds that magic students are often stereotyped as a group of eccentrics. Gesturing passionately, Gillis suggests that a student-led event to convey the fun of magic could beautifully show the value of magic research. Emery Rosensteel suddenly interrupts their conversation from his desk, asking Gillis what exactly he means by that. Adjusting his glasses, Gillis nervously faces the professor as Emery challenges him on how exactly they will plan a student-led school festival. Emery sternly lists the logistical nightmares, demanding to know how they will handle facilities, dates, negotiations, and obtaining permission to use the magic course's name. although intimidated Gillis insists that he will handle everything including the necessary budget. Emery sharply reprimands Gillis by stating that anyone can fantasize but execution requires careful planning, prompting Shinobu to snap that he doesn't have to be so harsh. Unfazed by her outburst, Emery casually agrees that Gillis' underlying point is valid. Frustrated by his dismissive attitude, Shinobu yells at Emery to value the students' independence more. Sneering down at her, Emery rhetorically asks if letting students act without planning or research truly counts as independence. Shinobu glares at the underhanded professor, arguing that students won't learn unless they fail and that repeating failures is how they become capable. She mentally fumes that while a perfect being like the professor might not understand, ordinary people need to experience small stumbles to grow. Leaning back, Emery concludes that she wants to provoke inexperienced students into making mistakes just to give them the valuable experience of failure. He coldly reminds her that as professors they are the ones held responsible for their students' failures and lack of guidance. Turning away angrily, Shinobu thinks it's unfair that professors only pity the failed students while clerks are held responsible for nothing and take no action. Deciding that Gillis' feelings aren't wrong despite the frustration, she turns back and firmly declares that she will take responsibility. Bursting with sudden determination, she promises to research all the procedures and get permission from the students and professors. Shocked by her sudden ambition, Gillis frantically lists off the overwhelming tasks like budget, schedule adjustments, and facility arrangements. Slamming her hands on the desk with fiery resolve, Shinobu yells that she will do everything herself. Gillis smiles warmly and pats her head, reminding her that a student-led event to convey the wonders of magic is exactly what the Academy Festival is for. She curses the cold-blooded Emery in her mind, frustrated that he was right about anyone being able to fantasize. Groaning as she furiously writes with a quill, she wonders why Emery is never satisfied unless he speaks so bluntly. Overwhelmed by the impossibly difficult logistics and budget assignments, Shinobu cries at her desk, realizing she took on way too much for someone who barely learned to read and write. As Emery casually drops another document on her desk, she silently screams at his icy attitude, instantly regretting her bold declaration. Spotting her struggle, Julian cheerfully waves a document and points out that Shinobu looks like she is having an incredibly tough time. Handing him the paperwork, a desperate Shinobu asks if he can secure the professor's approval signatures, only for Julian to grimace and admit he can probably only get about half of them. Pointing to specific names on the list, Julian reveals the stubborn existence of a bitter faction that actively hates Professor Rosenstiel. Joining the conversation, Theo calmly explains that the core issue is Professor Rosenstiel's reputation as a strict incantation supremacist. Julian elaborates that despite the magic department's many divided specialties, the mostly elderly professors have known each other for years and generally maintain a peaceful coexistence. That fragile peace shattered when the arrogant Rosenstiel arrived, using his rising popularity to make students mock traditional rituals and magic circles as completely outdated. A horrified Shinobu asks if the unpleasant professor was truly that extreme, prompting Julian to confirm that the veteran staff definitely did not find the blatant disrespect amusing. Theo further explains that the Academy's most senior faculty member, Professor Wurzner of the Magic Circle specialization, naturally rose up as the head of this bitter faction. Recalling a perpetually smiling old man she has never actually spoken to, Shinobu stares in disbelief as she tries to picture the seemingly gentle Professor Gotthold Wurzner holding such a grudge. Julian suddenly shifts the topic to Rosenstiel's mentor, noting that the legendary half-elf is actually an old acquaintance of Professor Wurzner. As Theo reveals, the mentor's name is Varvara Akatova, a legendary figure who reorganized scattered magic across the world. Shinobu silently marvels at the very real existence of half-elves. Snapping out of her fantasy, Shinobu acknowledges that Rosenstiel's mentor sounds incredibly great, before fiercely reminding herself that she cannot afford to space out right now. A sudden, confusing realization stops her in her tracks as she ponders the strange dynamic between the mentor and the feuding professors. Mentally mapping the complex relationships, she questions why Wurzner would harbor such intense hatred for Rosenstiel instead of holding his old friend's apprentice dear. Concluding that the spiteful professor simply made enemies everywhere with his zero charm, they agree the situation is likely a severe case of love turning into a hundredfold hatred. Staring thoughtfully at her paperwork, Shinobu quietly admits to herself that despite his nasty attitude, there are actually parts of the abrasive professor she cannot truly bring herself to hate. She proudly realizes that her newfound ability to fearlessly tackle and endlessly rewrite complicated documents is the direct result of surviving Rosenstiel's relentless daily insults. Knowing the professor's nasty remarks will inevitably continue anyway, she decides to gratefully accept Julian's offer to use his extensive connections for the upcoming Academy Festival. While Julian excitedly suggests using the Commerce Department's flashy events as a reference, Shinobu shrewdly calculates that the inactive Magic Department likely has a massive budget surplus to exploit. Smiling brightly, Gillis approaches as Shinobu realizes she urgently needs to prepare the complete proposal and application documents before anything else. Slamming a massive stack of paperwork onto the desk, Shinobu proudly shocks Gillis by revealing the staggering number of approval votes she already collected from the professors. Astonished by her efficiency, Gillis asks how she pulled it off, specifically noting that she somehow secured signatures from the stubborn anti-Rosenstiel faction that Julian couldn't crack. Puffing her chest with a confident, triumphant smile, Shinobu boasts that despite her unassuming appearance, she is actually quite well liked by the faculty. Holding her documents tightly, Shinobu blushes and beams with absolute pride over her hard-earned bureaucratic victory. Leaning in closer, Gillis asks if it is truly okay for things to be moving so smoothly, prompting a flushed Shinobu to confidently report that the remaining documents are almost finished. Adjusting his collar, Gillis warmly praises her, stating that their success is entirely because Shinobu is working so incredibly hard on their behalf. Deeply moved by the sincere praise, Shinobu grips her ribbon and humbly insists that they all must simply do what they can to support each other. Fired up with newfound motivation, she grabs her ledgers and sprints off, cheerfully declaring to the supportive Gillis that she will finish the remaining work and negotiate directly with the Lord. Using Julian's event documents as a perfect reference, her quill furiously flies across the parchment as she quickly compiles the official Academy Festival proposal and application forms. Marching purposefully toward the Central Plaza's administration building, she exhales a deep breath of relief, entirely confident that Theo's final review means her submitted documents are absolutely flawless. Standing before the grand statue of the goddess and spirit, Shinobu carefully examines a magical teleportation stone tablet. She confidently heads toward the Lord's Manor to meet the man who serves as both the territory's ruler and the Academy's director. Thanks to Theo's advance notice, a polite servant easily guides her through the massive estate. Inside the grand office, Ludwig Kleinbeck warmly welcomes Shinobu back to his manor. Greeting him respectfully, she silently recalls how his overwhelming handsomeness made her incredibly nervous during their first encounter. Watching the overworked Lord juggle his dual responsibilities, she worries about his health, since he constantly looks like he is about to collapse. Ludwig sighs and gently reminds her to drop the formalities and simply call him by his first name. Preferring to keep things strictly professional, she stubbornly apologizes and presents him with a stack of highly formal documents. Amused by her persistence, he accepts the stiffly written paperwork and agrees to look it over. She enthusiastically explains that the magic department is currently planning a major student-led event. Glancing at the slightly clumsy handwriting, Ludwig looks up and asks if she wrote the proposal herself. As he continues reading in silence, she anxiously notices his broad shoulders suddenly tense up. Ludwig silently studies the paperwork with an unreadable expression. Breaking the silence, he looks up and sincerely praises her for a job well done. He notes with an impressed smile that she has clearly been trained thoroughly to produce such high-quality work. Blushing furiously, she sheepishly admits that Theo and Professor Rosenstiel rigorously put her through the ringer to learn the process. Leaning back in his chair, Ludwig expresses profound relief that she is learning properly, since he cannot afford to keep useless people around. He playfully jokes that her competence means he won't have to throw her out to starve in the freezing winter, leaving her sweating nervously. As she mentally groans at his terrifyingly harsh sense of humor, Ludwig abruptly changes the subject to her supervising professor. Smirking knowingly, Ludwig bluntly states that handling administrative paperwork is the one thing Emery absolutely cannot do. Listening to him talk, Shinobu realizes that the Lord speaks about the terrifying professor as if he were just a troublesome younger brother. Ludwig seriously explains that while the budget is fine, he cannot officially approve the event without the proper professor's endorsements. She happily assumes she just needs to gather the remaining signatures, only for Ludwig to point out she is still dangerously short on them. Shifting the conversation entirely, he leans forward and asks if Emery has taught her about basic magic yet. Flashing back to the professor's intensely strict teaching methods, she nervously confirms that he has indeed started her lessons. Catching her strained expression, Ludwig astutely guesses that she is completely unconvinced Emery should be teaching anyone. Lowering his voice, Ludwig reveals that Emery has possessed an overwhelmingly terrifying amount of magic since he was a young child. He solemnly explains that shortly after Emery began learning to control it, his massive power violently ran wild. Ludwig heavily reveals that Emery's own family was severely injured after being caught in the resulting magical explosion. Shinobu stares at Ludwig in absolute stunned silence as the tragic reality of her strict professor's past finally sinks in. Looking deeply concerned, Shinobu asks if it is truly okay for her to hear about something so private. She insists that an absolute stranger like her shouldn't be allowed to know this, regardless of how much she despises Professor Rosenstiel. Adjusting his ribbon, Gillis softly explains that Emery himself stated it was absolutely necessary for her to know. Gillis reveals that Emery developed his famously uncharming personality during a training journey after becoming the apprentice of someone named Varvara Akatova. Her eyes widen in fearful realization as she remembers that a traveler from another world possesses terrifyingly great magical power. She anxiously wonders if being taught by Professor Rosenstiel will actually help her prevent her volatile magic from running wild. Gillis earnestly assures her that Emery knows exactly how to control it, ensuring the safety of both her and the surrounding territory. Staring at Emery's distant back in her mind, she listens as Gillis declares him the most suitable person to be her teacher. Waving cheerfully, Gillis tells her to think it over carefully while she nods in quiet agreement. Walking through the stone halls clutching her documents, she admits to feeling deeply bewildered by her power and absolutely dreads being taught by that sarcastic professor. Her thoughts are interrupted when a colleague calls her name, prompting her to turn and admit she still hasn't made up her mind. Slamming his hands on the desk in shock, her colleague demands to know why almost all the professors are suddenly retracting their signatures. He explains in a panic that Professor Wurzner has begun to seriously oppose their plan and has already spoken to the other professors. Shinobu pales as she realizes that Wurzner is basically the head honcho of the entire magic department. Ignoring her colleague's desperate pleas to wait, she sprints out of the office with fierce determination to speak to the man directly. Arriving at Professor Wurzner's laboratory, she is stopped by a bowl-cut boy who suspiciously asks who she might be. Realizing he is the professor's apprentice, she quickly introduces herself as an administrative clerk from the assistant division and asks if the professor is available. The apprentice casually notes that it is common for professors to use apprentices for personal affairs, unlike Rosenstiel, before telling her to wait while he checks. Without waiting for a response, the boy steps through an inner door to consult with the professor in the other room. Standing alone in the quiet library, Shinobu anxiously waits as the door clicks shut behind the apprentice. The boy returns moments later and bluntly tells her the professor is busy and she should just go home. Refusing to be dismissed so easily, she promises to come back when he has free time, but the apprentice coldly replies that the professor is always busy. Clenching her fists, she desperately shouts her apologies and insists that this is an incredibly important matter. Her eyes burn with absolute resolve as she mentally declares that she is not backing down here. Shoving past the panicked apprentice with a loud shout, she bursts through the inner door. She storms in to find a plump older man comfortably reading in a chair, instantly worrying about how he will react to her blatant intrusion. Stealing her nerves, she formally apologizes for the interruption and introduces herself as the clerk in charge of Professor Rosenstiel. Professor Wurzner slowly lowers his book and stares at her with a highly condescending gaze. Sneering down at the anxious clerk, he coldly remarks that kid, Rosenstiel, clearly hasn't taught his handler any manners either. Realizing Wurzner is far more sarcastic and hostile than his friendly reputation suggests, she braces herself for the incoming disrespect while standing her ground. Looking at a textbook, Shinobu listens intently as someone explains that certain students have started looking down on magic circles and rituals, causing a major problem for Professor Wurzner. Sipping tea in his office, the elderly professor eloquently lists his intense grievances, accusing Rosenstiel of acting like he owns the place and delighting in tearing down years of academic solidarity. Gripping his cup, Wurzner angrily mimics the young professor's arrogant attitude, complaining that Rosenstiel acts like everyone else is a moron. Overwhelmed by the endless stream of complaints, Shinobu forces her eyes shut and nods along to the grumbling with an expression of pure exhaustion. Seeing her genuine reaction, the professor misinterprets her strained face as deep, heartfelt agreement. Leaning back in his chair, Wurzner warmly notes that Shinobu seems to be having a hard time with that arrogant kid as well. Seizing the momentary connection, Shinobu firmly declares that she has come to ask for his signature regarding the student-organized school festival. Suddenly, a boy named Camel bursts in, shouting angrily that Rosenstiel's devotees only sing praises of spells and completely ignore magic circle lectures. Wurzner calmly orders Camel to stop, and confirming Shinobu's identity, states that he doesn't believe the students are capable of proper management. Smiling with cheerful malice, the mustached professor admits he is fed up with disrespectful students and flatly declares his absolute hatred for Professor Rosenstiel. He refuses to sign the document, vowing to make his opposition clearly known to the other professors, completely ignoring Shinobu's desperate attempts to negotiate. Clutching the rejected application form to her chest, Shinobu trembles as she realizes all her hard work went to waste in a total defeat. She hangs her head in deep shame, agonizing over how she can possibly face Julian, Theo, and Gillis after they cooperated so much. A familiar stern voice suddenly cuts through her despair by asking what she is doing. Shinobu freezes, her face draining of color as she realizes exactly whose voice she is hearing. She mentally kicks herself, realizing she unconsciously walked straight to the culprit professor's lecture hall in a total daze. Emerging from the room, Rosenstiel bluntly orders her to help him clean up since the lecture finished ages ago. Still reeling from her embarrassment, she weakly agrees to help him. Slapping her cheeks to switch gears, she resolves to focus entirely on her work. Later, Shinobu turns in confusion as she notices the tower corridor becoming awfully hectic with gossiping students. Students sprint past her toward the practical training hall, excitedly yelling that a rare duel is about to occur involving that particular professor. Spotting Julian casually waving in the crowd, a frantic Shinobu asks if someone should report the dangerous situation to the assistant division to stop it. Julian completely shocks her by revealing that the duel is actually between Professor Wurzner and Professor Rosenstiel. A booming voice announces that, in accordance with ancient tradition, victory will not be decided until one side explicitly yields. Smiling confidently, Wurzner acknowledges that while the method is barbaric, it remains wonderfully simple. Extending his hand, Wurzner dictates that the loser must accept the winner's demands, no matter what they may be. Wondering why the gloomy Rosenstiel would ever leave his lab for this, Shinobu watches in awe as he formally accepts the terms without objection. With absolute seriousness, Rosenstiel declares that if he wins, his demand is the festival signature. Shinobu's eyes widen in sheer stunned disbelief at his unexpected motivation. Mind racing, she completely fails to understand why he is suddenly fighting for the festival approval after previously nitpicking everything and refusing to help her. A furious challenger aggressively points an accusatory finger at Emery. He loudly and boldly demands that Emery resign from his professorship immediately. Looking at the utterly unbalanced terms of the duel, Shinobu realizes in shock just how deeply the older man hates her professor. A group of somber onlookers steps forward to officially act as the witnesses for the impending magical battle. The duelists pace away from each other as the referee counts down, instructing them to turn on the 10th step and begin the fight. As the battle suddenly erupts, someone in the crowd shouts in surprise while wondering if the challenger is using powerful wind magic. Watching Emery get violently sliced by the relentless barrage of frustrated student yells that using so many spells at once is completely cowardly. Flashbacking to after the chaotic battle, a frantic Shinobu desperately checks Emery's bloody face and arm while asking where else he is hurt. Emery calmly remarks that it is a relief his thick robe hid the worst of the damage, while she urgently gathers plenty of disinfectant. When he winces in pain and calls her a fool, Shinobu hurriedly apologizes and promises to apply the medicine much more gently. Back in the duel, a spectator explains that Professor Wurzner stocks up on his specialty magic circles every day to prove that a mage's battle begins long before the actual fight. Watching the terrifying display of magic, Shinobu panics and screams for them to wait, as she realizes the brutal attack won't end with just simple cuts. Examining his charred tools amidst the smoke, Emery coolly notes that durability truly becomes a serious issue for paper magic circles. Stunned by the massive silent flame that suddenly engulfed the arena, the defeated challenger quickly yields to the young professor's overwhelming power. Standing victorious over his older opponent, Emery coldly presents a document and demands the man sign it exactly as promised. Watching the unbelievable outcome in absolute shock, Shinobu gasps as she realizes her strict professor actually won the impossible duel. The defeated Wurzner stares up from the ground, utterly bewildered as to why his seemingly perfect strategy failed. He weakly realizes that Emery must have secretly inscribed hidden magic circles onto solid metal plates to survive the deadly onslaught. Looking down with a blank expression, Emery casually confirms that the metal plates allowed him to miraculously escape with only light injuries. Professor Wurzner suddenly bursts into hearty laughter, completely confusing the tense crowd as he playfully asks what Emery is talking about. Emery merely responds to the sudden laughter with a quiet, knowing smirk. Closing his eyes, Emery calmly acknowledges that it isn't the first time he has been completely misunderstood as a bitter misanthrope. The older man affectionately scolds Emery for being an unsociable brat who hides in his lab playing with magic instead of truly seeing the world. Stepping closer, Emery sincerely admits that Wurzner is exactly right and that he came to this public duel specifically to verify that fact. Looking out over the massive crowd of stunned students, Emery reflects on how many people are gathered here with their own incredibly diverse thoughts. Meeting Wurzner's gaze, Emery firmly states that meanings get dangerously twisted when spoken through others, which is exactly why they must communicate face to face. He passionately explains that his devotion to spells comes from a place of deep academic interest while respectfully asking if the older professor feels the same way. Wurzner smiles warmly and shows off a finely crafted magic circle while agreeing that he is already well aware of their incredible depth and beauty. Realizing Emery isn't aggressively claiming absolute supremacy after all, Wurzner happily admits his own misunderstanding as the nervous crowd finally relaxes. Shaking hands in mutual respect, Emery humbly admits he still has a long way to go compared to the veteran professor, who proudly praises the young man's profound understanding of magic. Reflecting on Emery's surprising behavior, Shinobu notes that he is definitely not the type to offer empty flattery. She realizes that when he praises someone, he genuinely means it and is being unexpectedly humble. Her colleagues join her in wondering what kind of magical change of heart the professor underwent to suddenly start behaving like a real human being. News of his unexpected confrontation with Professor Wurzner spreads like wildfire, becoming known to everyone in the tower in a flash. Seeking him out after the dramatic incident, Shinobu quietly approaches Professor Rosensteel's lecture hall. Peeking nervously through the door, she politely asks if the professor is currently resting in his lab. Opening the door fully, she finds Emery slumped exhaustedly in a chair with his long legs stretched out across the room. Stepping into the dimly lit room filled with magical diagrams, she softly thanks him for what he did, prompting a confused mumble from him. Emery slowly turns his head, letting out a quiet sigh of acknowledgement as he looks up at her. Noticing his pale complexion, she anxiously asks if he has properly treated his wounds yet. When he dismissively claims such small wounds will heal on their own, she firmly scolds him about the dangerous risk of infections. Stepping closer to treat his injuries, Shinobu is suddenly captivated upon seeing his striking face up close. She is mesmerized by his incredibly smooth skin and fine features, realizing he possesses a delicate beauty rarely seen even among women. Breaking the quiet tension, Emery bluntly looks at her and asks if she hates him. Startled by the incredibly direct question, Shinobu retorts that asking such a thing is a rather childish way of putting it. Emery calmly explains that it is simply the mindset of someone raised without social skills, noting that adults eventually learn to get along even with people they dislike. Smiling slightly, Shinobu admits that his bluntness actually makes him cute, noting there are far worse people out in the world. She explains that while she was definitely pissed off at him before, she respects that he never says things that are fundamentally wrong. Taking his hand gently, she advises him that being right isn't enough to make others cooperate if he remains inflexible and narrow-minded. Reflecting on her own failures, she shares that her job hunt went poorly because she was obsessed with finding the strictly right behavior. She admits she mistakenly thought getting a job was the final goal, completely forgetting that a workplace is built on living, breathing humans. Offering a warm smile, she gently tells the professor that he looked genuinely cool standing up for them today. She thinks to herself that despite his intense fight with Wurzner, the sincere praise simply slipped out of her mouth naturally. Looking away with a faint blush, Emery quietly acknowledges that she has been working incredibly hard too. The tender atmosphere is completely shattered when Emery suddenly moves with startling speed and a loud shout. Shinobu gasps in sheer horror as a massive, intimidating stack of papers is suddenly slammed down onto the desk in front of her. Staring at the massive pile, she immediately recognizes the crucial school festival documents that she thought she had lost yesterday. As Emery teasingly asks if she left them behind on purpose, she frantically denies the unfair accusation. Flashing a highly smug and victorious smile, Emery casually remarks that he figured as much. Leaning into her touch, he notes that her unusual meekness and rare praise are ruined by the fact that she is clumsily messing up his hair. Reflecting on her status as a pitiful traveler, Shinobu admits her frustration over doubting the unexpected kindness of the people around her. Professor Emery Rosenstiel proves to be the harsh exception, ruthlessly calling her an ignorant idiot and thrusting unpleasant truths at her without a shred of pity. Despite her anger at his insults, she realizes that his relentless pushing actually expanded her knowledge and completely transformed her way of thinking. Recalling how she mastered an unknown language in mere months, she remembers the rare, genuine smile he gave her without a trace of mockery. Placing a gentle hand on her head, Emery acknowledges that many students now look up to her, since she successfully writes complex proposals and applications. He softly praises her, stating that her impressive progress is entirely the result of her own relentless hard work. Standing proudly beside the imposing maid, Shinobu realizes that while he lacks any real kindness, his harsh words have become her guiding lightposts. Filled with a newfound determination, the young traveler looks up with unwavering resolve in her eyes. Driven by her sudden inspiration, she earnestly asks the professor to teach her the fundamentals of basic magic. Staring at him with pleading eyes, she formally requests his personal instruction. Emery gazes back at her with a slightly surprised but intense expression as he processes her request to learn basic magic. Sometime later, Julian happily reports that the school festival was officially approved, while preparations proceed steadily in the background. Meanwhile, Emery officially begins his basic magic lessons twice a week in the quiet evenings after classes and work have settled down. Standing before a chalkboard, Emery explains that magic is fundamentally the art of controlling the spirits of fire, water, wind, and earth. Drawing a diagram, he clarifies that while combining elements is possible, magic is not omnipotent because the foundational law of the four elements cannot be overturned. When Shinobu naively assumes healing magic would be easy, Emery immediately shuts her down by declaring that healing wounds or reviving the dead is utterly impossible. He explains that true healing was once a divine power borrowed from the goddess, but it was lost to time and is now considered a strict taboo. Looking grim, Emery reveals that some ambitious mages actually attempted to revive the lost art of healing magic with horrific methods. A horrified Shinobu asks if human experimentation on injured people was required, and Emery coldly confirms her darkest suspicion. Because of that gruesome history, he notes that healing magic remains strictly regulated by the kingdom's laws. Shifting the focus back to the present, he reminds her that she must master basic magic before ever attempting composite or healing spells. Annoyed by the long exposition, Shinobu impatiently demands that he start the actual lesson on primary spells, prompting Emery to point out her inability to use even the simplest magic. Despite her loud complaints about his motivation-killing attitude, Emery sits at the desk looking completely unconcerned. Leaning in closely, the spell construction specialist firmly warns her that the true answer to magic does not reside within her own body. He clarifies that while advanced magic operates differently, basic magic relies entirely on external forces. Slamming a massive heavy tome onto the desk, Emery declares that the answer she seeks lies only within its pages. He strictly commands her to open the primary spell collection to page 9 and begin reading from the third line. Distracted by his closeness and the smell of old books, Shinobu haltingly stumbles through an incantation calling upon the wind spirit. Sighing at her terrible fragmented reading, Emery leans over and begins to flawlessly recite the spirit of wind incantation himself. His smooth, commanding voice effortlessly calls upon the lover of freedom to shake the leaves and blow a brief wind of connection. Watching Emery effortlessly cast a spell, Shinobu gazes up at the dazzling display of magical energy in absolute awe. Flipping through a heavy tome, she realizes she is finally witnessing the true mechanism of magic for the very first time. Startled by the sheer complexity, she frantically points out that Theo and the other students never use such long drawn-out chants. Surprised when the professor suddenly praises her sharp observation skills, she stammers out a flustered thanks. Emery smoothly explains that the technique they are currently analyzing is known as spell shortening. He softly recites a simple activation phrase inviting the magic to come and play here. Demonstrating the technique with a swift gesture, Emery notes that highly advanced users can make their spells even shorter. Noticing her losing focus during the complicated lecture, he sharply reminds her that subtle intonations can activate magic with just a shake or blow. Panicking slightly at the sheer volume of information, she stammers out a question asking exactly why magic still works even when the spell is heavily abbreviated. Holding up a piece of chalk, Emery calmly explains that possessing inherent magic power is the absolute key point. He uses a simple campfire metaphor to illustrate that spells act as the firewood burning the kindling known as magic power borrowed from the spirits. He adds that shortening spells becomes possible only by perfectly grasping the unique verses and rhythmic preferences of different spirits. He clarifies that while ordinary humans struggle with shortened spells, those possessing high magic power are easily favored by spirits. Leaning in closely, he challenges the thoroughly confused Shinobu to try casting the simple breeze spell from earlier. He gently prompts her to use the incredibly brief activation phrase. Nervously following his direct instructions, she hesitantly repeats the short phrase while cautiously reaching out her hand. Her eyes widen in absolute shock as a sudden massive burst of magical energy violently erupts from her spell. The two of them stand in complete stunned silence as the chaotic paper-swirling aftermath settles around them. Utterly mortified by the disastrous result, Shinobu drops to the floor and grovels in a desperate wailing apology. Stroking his chin thoughtfully, Emery calmly observes that the resulting magical blast was significantly bigger than he ever expected. Kneeling down to her level, he admits that her extraordinary affinity with spirits actually exceeds even his own and finds the phenomenon deeply fascinating. Staring intensely into her eyes, he decides they must systematically test low-intensity spells to see if she is loved by all spirits or just the wind. Overwhelmed by his sudden intense proximity, Shinobu frantically raises her hands to interrupt his rapid train of thought. Gesturing wildly to the chaotic paper-strewn laboratory, she desperately suggests they should probably clean up the massive mess first. Completely ignoring the disaster around them, Emery stands tall and declares she must immediately learn to properly sense spirits and control her immense magic power. Clutching her chest in utter bewilderment, Shinobu frantically admits that she has absolutely no idea how to sense a spirit's invisible presence. Sighing softly, Emery confidently extends his hand toward her and states it would be much quicker to simply teach her the physical sensation directly. As she spaces out, staring blankly at his outstretched palm, he sharply orders her to stop hesitating and just give him her hand. Carefully placing her hand in his, she suddenly notices how his long, slender fingers paradoxically exude an intense masculinity that deeply flusters her. Blushing furiously, she realizes his surprisingly bony hands look delicate but actually possess enough hidden, intimidating strength to easily crush her own. Guiding her through the process, Emery instructs Shinobu to concentrate and feel the magic flowing from him. Startled by the sudden display of magical energy, Shinobu asks if he can see the glowing lights materializing around them. She points out the green, red, blue, and black lights clinging closely to them before noting that there are also gold ones. Emery's eyes widen slightly in surprise as he repeats the mention of gold lights and thoughtfully murmurs to himself. He explains that these floating lights are likely spirits, noting with fascination that he has never actually seen gold ones before. Shinobu gasps as Emery theorizes that the golden spirits might be a special form of protection usable only by travelers. Raising a finger to emphasize his point, Emery states that their absolute priority is to learn how spirits operate. He smoothly explains that spirits are naturally attracted to sources of magic power. Shinobu watches in complete awe as a tiny red light gently lands right on Emery's fingernail. The tiny light suddenly erupts into a flicker of fire as Emery reveals that spirits actively devour magic power. He elaborates that a normal human wouldn't passively leak enough magic for the hungry spirits to feast upon. Staring intensely at her, Emery warns that because they both possess immense magic power, they must actively learn to suppress it. He solemnly adds that she must master this control if she doesn't want her power to violently hurt the people around her. Remembering Ludwig's warning about Emery's childhood magic going out of control, Shinobu nervously apologizes for bringing up his past. She recalls the tragic detail that his own older sister was severely injured in the magical blast. Looking away with a darkened expression, Emery quietly admits that he gave Ludwig permission to discuss that incident. Sensing the heavy atmosphere, Shinobu realizes she absolutely cannot ask him for any more details about the tragedy. Despite his verbal permission to talk about it, Shinobu clearly notices Emery's face visibly stiffen in pain. Staring at his back, she feels an overwhelming sense that his composure might completely shatter if she stepped in carelessly. Walking away from the encounter, she reflects on how incredibly fragile and unstable the mighty professor truly seemed. Back at the bustling academy, students cheerfully thank Gillis for his invaluable help in negotiating and organizing the stage props. Adjusting his glasses with a bright smile, Gillis announces that the preparations for the Academy Festival are officially in their final stretch. Meanwhile, in the clerk office, the staff casually discuss how the festival preparations are completely left to the independent students. Enjoying a coffee break, Shinobu complains that her very first basic magic class ended with her having to clean up a huge mess. She remembers attending Professor Rosensteel's utterly chaotic magic session the previous day. Theo and Julian listen intently as Shinobu explains that Emery's methods are totally different from the standard spells they normally learn. Looking over her cup, she wonders aloud to her colleagues if the incantations themselves are completely different. Theo explains that nobles and commoners learn magic differently, prompting him to ask Julian to demonstrate the basic light breeze spell. Julian confidently strikes a pose and begins reciting a folksy, highly casual incantation about inviting someone over to play. Shinobu and Theo stare at him in absolute shock as Julian practically admits his ridiculous incantation is basically a giant joke. Sitting with the friendly professors, Shinobu echoes the word in surprise as they reveal the shortened form of the spell is greenie. Bursting into laughter, Julian finds the ridiculous name incredibly funny while noting its practicality for instantly drying ink. Ignoring Shinobu's nervous protests about yesterday's disaster, Theo cheerfully encourages her to try the spell herself. Excitement builds as Julian loudly warns everyone to secure their belongings before Shinobu practices her wind magic. Sweating nervously, Shinobu panics internally since her friends have no idea about the catastrophic mess she made in the lab yesterday. Taking a deep breath, she softly chants the embarrassing trigger word to activate the magic. Shutting her eyes tightly against the impending chaos, she braces her body for a terrible outcome. A massive gust of wind violently erupts through the room and physically blows Julian and the older professor backward. Opening her eyes to utter shock, she finds her friends enthusiastically congratulating her on a massive success. Julian excitedly points out the spell's amazing practical uses, praising how it instantly dries both wet hair and fresh ink. Despite its undeniable usefulness, Shinobu secretly wishes she could use the much cooler-sounding come and play spell instead of the embarrassing greenie. Peeking nervously through a cracked door, she resolves to seek out the only person capable of explaining why her attempts at the cooler spell always end in failure. Mustering her courage, she plots to strike up a casual conversation with her gloomy master, Professor Emery Rosensteel. Lingering awkwardly after class, she clutches her notebook and desperately tries to figure out how to naturally approach him. Her confidence completely crumbles as she complains internally about the sheer impossibility of making small talk with someone possessing zero friendliness. Slapping her own cheeks to build resolve, she fiercely motivates herself to endure the awkwardness for the sake of learning a cool spell. Startling her out of her thoughts, the imposing professor bluntly asks what exactly she needs from him. Staring down with piercing eyes, Emery commands her to stop hovering and just spit out whatever she wants to say. Wilting under his suspicious glare and impatient demands, she frantically stammers out an apology. Momentarily distracted by his fully revealed handsome face, she finally blurts out her question about the greenie spell. The atmosphere instantly freezes as Emery processes the forbidden word with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. While the surrounding students frantically stampede for the exit in sheer terror, an oblivious Shinobu innocently asks why the two wind spells produce such different effects. Emery violently slams his hands onto the desk, causing Shinobu to shriek in pure terror. Looming over her trembling form like a vengeful shadow, he demands to know if she actually cast that spell. Eyes burning with an unholy light, he terrifyingly repeats his accusation as she cowers beneath him. Trembling in absolute fear, she frantically apologizes while internally screaming that his beautiful face has literally transformed into a demonic mask. Stomping the ground in a furious tantrum, Emery screams that he completely refuses to acknowledge such a crude, vulgar spell that ruins all magical refinement. Flinging his head back in absolute disgust, he shrieks against the sheer nonsense of the spell's existence. Leaning in close, he aggressively forbids her from ever chanting spells without his direct supervision as long as he remains her teacher. Swearing to forcefully drill the proper light breeze spell into her head, no matter what, he leaves Shinobu to reflect on accidentally violating one of the Academy's 3 unspoken taboos. Detailing the rough, lively nature of the merchant-heavy Neptune region, the narration explains that its brash style heavily influences its local spells. Since the strict Professor Emery Rosensteel is completely obsessed with linguistic beauty, students know they must absolutely never trigger his explosive anger by mentioning Neptune spells in his presence. Meanwhile, Shinobu recalls how she was brutally forced to repeat a simple spell over and over during the agonizing days leading up to the Academy Festival. Finally, on the bustling first day of the festival, an overwhelmed Shinobu frantically directs students toward the 4th floor Platine Hall for the upcoming play. Pointing down the hallway, she cheerfully wishes the performers good luck and assures them the dressing room is totally free to use. Exhaustedly running up the grand staircase, Shinobu notes that the prestigious 2-day festival invites nobles on the first day and commoners on the second. Overhearing excited chatter about a play regarding basic magic compilation, Shinobu deeply wishes she had time to look around and enjoy the festivities. Just as her energy starts fading, a smiling Theo smoothly approaches her in the sunlit corridor. Teetering on wobbly knees from endlessly running up and down stairs, Shinobu greets him while he warmly asks if she has eaten anything yet. Groaning that she completely missed her chance to eat during the performance, she is immensely relieved when Theo graciously offers to take over her remaining tasks. Adjusting his glasses with a knowing smile, Theo kindly urges her to go enjoy the festival since she clearly wants to see what the students put together. Her eyes sparkling with overwhelming gratitude, Shinobu enthusiastically agrees to go explore. Following an absolutely irresistible aroma she noticed on the stairs, she eagerly heads straight for the 5th-floor courtyard. Stretching her sore arms in the bright courtyard, she marvels at how incredibly strange and wonderful the sprawling indoor space feels. Tracking the mouth-watering scent directly to the bustling food stall area, she is immediately welcomed by enthusiastic student vendors. She excitedly surveys the exotic menu, completely captivated by the ritual-style desserts and legendary mana-boosting meat dishes. Browsing the magic-inspired cuisine, Shinobu critically decides to pass on the pharmacy major's questionable skewered lizard. Suddenly distracted, she carelessly bumps into a cloaked figure and immediately stammers out a flustered apology. Catching a glimpse of incredibly rare soft silvery white hair beneath the stranger's hood, Shinobu realizes the girl looks shockingly familiar. Her eyes widening in sheer panic, Shinobu gasps as she recognizes the beautiful girl as the professor's fiancée. Before Shinobu can loudly announce her identity, the frantic girl shushes her and desperately begs her to keep it a secret. Shinobu stares in absolute stunned silence, completely overwhelmed by the sudden appearance of Professor Emery Rosensteel's beautiful fiancée. Shortly after, Shinobu enters absolute culinary bliss as she greedily devours hearty spiced meat and herb-scented fruit juice. Stuffing her cheeks with delicious food, she mentally apologizes for bothering the young lady, while explaining exactly how she ended up sitting with the professor's fiancé. Flashing back to the encounter, the desperate girl had begged Shinobu to keep her incognito status an absolute secret. Seeing the noblewoman nervously trying to stay hidden and incredibly anxious, Shinobu had asked if her disguise was truly okay. Since the starving Shinobu hadn't eaten lunch yet, the noblewoman had graciously offered to treat her, leading to their current awkward lunch date. The beautiful girl gently introduces herself simply as Zafi, completely shocking Shinobu by casually admitting she only came to the festival because it looked fun not to see Emery. Nibbling her food in confusion, Shinobu wonders why fiancés wouldn't meet up, prompting Zafi to lean in and ask if Shinobu knows what Emery said at their marriage meeting. Smiling wistfully, Zafi reveals that Emery bluntly told her he only came to appease his family's worries, but still fully intends to marry her. Zafi notes that everyone around her places their expectations on her along with their love, making his clarity much easier to deal with. She expresses hatred for being told she could have been the princess consort and getting hit with a stick by her etiquette tutor for mistakes. Zafi clarifies she doesn't mind physical pain but resents being told it is for her own sake by people who don't truly care about her. She understands her parents want to give her happiness, prompting Shinobu to ask if marrying the professor will genuinely make her happy. Zafi calmly states that love is not required in noble marriages, shocking Shinobu. Shinobu wonders if her inability to understand this loveless system stems from her past life in Japan. Chuckling, Zafi calls Shinobu a strange person for worrying about someone else's problems as if they were her own. Acknowledging her own selfishness, Zafi notes that not even her friend Olivier ever spoke to her so bluntly. She admits to playing the tragic heroine despite attaining the rare good fortune of marrying a handsome pedigreed man who will provide for her. Shinobu argues that Emery Rosensteel's undeveloped personality makes him unfit to be a husband regardless of his help during the Wurzner incident. Zafi drops the bombshell that the professor is actually the youngest son of a ducal house and the king's nephew. Reeling from the shock, Shinobu realizes the gloomy, out-of-touch man would have been royalty in another time. She recalls that he was separated from his family early on to train in magic. Shinobu deduces that injuring an older sister of such high noble status must have been a massive incident. Shaking her head, Shinobu firmly decides this is not the time to sympathize with him. Zafi leans in and asks Shinobu for her honest thoughts about Professor Rosensteel. Nearly spitting out her juice, Shinobu shudders that she receives nothing but persistent sarcastic remarks from him every day. Zafi smiles and agrees, noting that her own clumsy reading and spelling usually invite his typical critiques about her messy handwriting. Zafi insists he wouldn't engage if he didn't like her, but a distressed Shinobu tragically declares he is just irritated by her ignorance. Zafi counters that if it were merely an obligation to a subordinate, he would just go through the motions and talk about the weather. Shinobu exhaustedly recalls his expressionless weather comments, completely rejecting Zafi's claim that she is receiving special treatment. Zafi laughs off Shinobu's denial, just as Shinobu notices the clock and realizes she is late. Having finished her meal, Zafi admits she wanted to try working, but Shinobu warns her it takes immense physical and mental strength before rushing off. Shinobu reflects that while she is just a small cog in society, her dizzying daily work introduces her to various people and expands her connections. She admits to secretly admiring Zafi's elegant fantasy princess lifestyle, musing that people always want what they do not have. Shinobu waves goodbye and declines Zafi's playful offer to switch places, knowing someone would get furious. Back inside, Gillis intercepts a frantic Shinobu, noting the disparity in workloads and ordering her to take another break. Ignoring her protests, he pushes her into the auditorium during intermission so she can watch the play she helped create. Entering the theater, Shinobu spots an open seat at the end of a row and happily calls out to Gillis. Gillis turns back to look at Shinobu with a warm, gentle smile. Enjoying her break, Shinobu is surprised when Gillis approaches and asks if she came to watch the play. She suddenly notices a glaring crowd of young ladies fiercely aiming for Gillis. Gillis playfully notes she looked busy this morning, explaining he arrived while his admirers were keeping each other in check, which only annoys the crowd more because the two are talking like they are close. Feeling intensely uncomfortable under the glares, Shinobu stammers that she should go back because she is worried about work. Suddenly, Gillis firmly grabs her hand. Startled by the unexpected touch, Shinobu lets out a confused gasp. Gillis leans in close, placing a finger to his lips and telling her to be quiet because the play will start soon. With a charming smile, he reminds everyone to take their seats since the performance is beginning shortly and it is still her break time. Feeling completely trapped by the situation, Shinobu exhales and resigns herself with a defeated agreement. She sits wide-eyed, letting out another bewildered sound as the lights begin to dim. In the darkness, she looks up in surprise as Gillis puts strength into the hand grabbing hers. The play she sees for the first time in this other world is amazing, featuring people flying through the air, blooming plants, dancing fireballs, and falling snow. She finds herself captivated by the performance, but the real reason she cannot quite focus is because Gillis refuses to let go of her hand the entire time. Admitting that she lost the urge to leave her seat once the play started, she realizes he didn't actually have to keep restraining her. On the second day of the school festival, the crowd erupts with joy as children declare they want to become mages too after seeing the beautiful magical snowflakes. Shinobu smiles warmly, noting that the commoner guests are honestly enjoying themselves and showing easily understandable reactions. The students can clearly tell the play is well received as the crowd seems even more motivated and joyful than yesterday. Announcing the end of the pre-lunch performance, Shinobu grabs her dustpan to take her break in the courtyard. She happily observes that the festival atmosphere feels even livelier today than yesterday. Arriving at the table with her mug, she warmly greets Lord Ludwig and the professor. Lord Ludwig casually mentions he brought Emery along too and asks if she is having lunch. Seeking a safe topic, Shinobu claps her hands together and praises the amazing idea of having a menu entirely based on magic. The professor dismissively retorts that normal people cannot do that, pointing out that such magical recipes are in the diaries of the deceased and ritual records that anyone could look up. Mid-bite, Shinobu awkwardly points out that normal people do not actually learn ancient scripts. Both Shinobu and the professor freeze in utter shock as Lord Ludwig casually remarks that the two of them have gotten quite close. They immediately shoot synchronized furious glares at the oblivious lord. The professor and Shinobu fiercely snap back in unison, furiously asking Lord Ludwig if he is blind or has bad eyesight. In a blatant change of subject, Shinobu hastily asks Lord Ludwig if he is participating on both days since they all ended up together. Ludwig confirms he is participating because he wants to check the guests' reactions too, even though he cannot stay all day. Shinobu happily remarks that many parents seemed relieved as the play allowed them to imagine the path their children will take after learning magic. The blonde man cheerfully notes that while some still view them as weirdos, awareness has slightly raised, and it will be a topic of conversation for commoners since gossip is entertainment without the internet. The girl eagerly takes notes as he explains that while one-time events don't show results, it might be necessary to compile this time's procedures, flow good points and areas for improvement into a report. She bows and thanks him profusely as he casually announces he is returning to the mansion soon. Waving goodbye, he cheerfully leaves Professor Emery in her care, leaving her utterly confused. She narrows her eyes suspiciously when he justifies his request by claiming the professor has absolutely no sense of direction. Sighing in resignation, she accepts her task as the blonde man waves goodbye, leaving her alone with the glaring professor. Pushing the directionally challenged professor out of her mind for a moment, she happily decides to focus back on her meal. She savors every delightful bite of the crispy pie crust, tender minced meat, and thick potato paste while moistening her mouth with rich vegetable soup before finally giving thanks for the meal. The professor raises an eyebrow and dryly comments that her post-meal prayer was awfully short. Sweating nervously, she quickly changes the subject by pointing out a statue of the goddess and cheerfully asking if they should look at the stalls together. The professor sighs and states he has no more business here, but she aggressively argues that walking him back to the lab and returning would be a waste of effort and ruin her break. Grabbing her trash, she commands him to follow her properly and warns him that she won't be responsible if he gets lost. After finishing her meal, she efficiently throws her wrapper in the trash bin and returns the soup cup to the stall. Glancing over her shoulder with a satisfied smile, she checks to make sure the professor is actually following her properly. Spotting a row of vendors, she taps her chin and eagerly decides to check out the stalls selling accessories and trinkets. She stares in awe at the lovely astrology charts, ritual animal dolls, and magic circle plates, wondering if she should buy at least one thing for herself. Turning her head to check on her companion, she suddenly realizes he is nowhere to be found. Panic immediately sets in as she screams the professor's name, terrified that she has already lost him. A calm voice cuts through her panic, casually announcing that he is right here. Startled, she whirls around with a wildly flustered expression and loudly apologizes. Leaving no room for argument, she grabs his arm and declares they must hold hands so they don't get separated again. The professor flinches and looks away in intense frustration, admitting he said something outrageous out of sheer embarrassment. Instead of holding her hand, he pinches the fabric of her sleeve and stubbornly claims that this is sufficient. She stares down in surprise at his gloved hand delicately gripping her sleeve. Matching his slow pace, she smiles warmly as the professor carefully walks ahead, taking it one step at a time. They arrive at a jewelry stall where she immediately recognizes the crystal necklaces with carved magic circles that Lord Ludwig mentioned earlier. Holding up a crystal pendant, she asks if it actually has an effect, prompting the professor to lean in and note that it is quite an intricate talisman magic circle. As the vendor happily points out that the professor bought two, Emery explains that since there are no mistakes in the circle, it has the effect of protecting the body. The professor quietly holds the two purchased pendants in his hands. Draping one of the sparkling crystal pendants in front of her, he firmly instructs her to keep it. Glaring at her clumsiness, Emery harshly warns Shinobu that she will die instantly if she continues wandering around so carelessly. Dropping a small amulet into her hands, he tells her to keep it while she sarcastically accepts whatever protection she can get. Admiring the intricate and finely drawn design on the amulet, Shinobu praises the magic circle student's hard work before suddenly pausing in realization. Horrified to realize Emery is wearing the exact same amulet, Shinobu internally panics over the matching but quickly dismisses the romantic thought since he is such a sarcastic jerk. Transitioning to a scenic view of the academy, the narration reveals that the second day of the festival concluded without incident and ended in a massive success. Raising their glasses in celebration, Julian and Shinobu express their deep gratitude to the professors and administrative staff for supporting the event. Standing before the gathered festival workers in the Platine Hall, Gillis warmly kicks off a small afterparty complete with a live orchestra. Smiling brightly, Gillis proudly notes that the well-received festival successfully promoted high magic while giving them an opportunity to explore its everyday usefulness. Beaming as she claps alongside the fulfilled crowd, Shinobu happily listens as Gillis proposes continuing the festival, so it becomes a beloved tradition. Shifting his focus, Gillis dramatically directs everyone's attention to Shinobu and formally thanks her for working tirelessly to support the event. Caught completely off guard by the sudden spotlight, a shocked Shinobu gasps as the entire crowd turns toward her to give their roaring thanks. Overwhelmed by the chorus of joyful gratitude and cheers from the students, Shinobu's eyes well up with emotional tears. Taking in the heartfelt appreciation from everyone around her, she realizes that all her hard work was entirely worth it. Bowing humbly with a flushed face, Shinobu admits she would have given up without their advice and celebrates that they built this success together. Spotting Professor Rosenstiel in the crowd, she notices him applauding expressionlessly but takes comfort in knowing he is genuinely acknowledging their hard work. As glasses clink together in a cheerful toast, the afterparty officially begins with students and professors mingling in a uniquely relaxed atmosphere. Immersing herself in the lively festivities, Shinobu thoroughly enjoys chatting about obscure magical items with eccentric people she has never spoken to before. Amusedly observing her friend's various antics across the room, Shinobu suddenly realizes that she hasn't seen Gillis anywhere during the party. Wandering backstage with her drink in hand, Shinobu casually notes that the handsome Gillis would normally be surrounded by adoring girls if he were present. Finding Gillis resting quietly on a chair backstage, Shinobu thanks him for his hard work and asks if he is still busy managing the cleanup. Offering him a refreshing cup of citrus juice, Shinobu smiles warmly as Gillis gratefully accepts it and admits he was just getting thirsty. Remarking on the surprising quietness of the backstage area compared to the bustling hall, Shinobu turns attentively when Gillis suddenly calls her name. Patting the empty space beside him, Gillis invites her to sit down, causing Shinobu to feel nervous over his unusually awkward and tense demeanor. Leaning in close with an incredibly intense and serious gaze, Gillis softly speaks her name once more. Gently taking both of her hands in his, Gillis declares his desire to cherish her, leaving a flustered Shinobu to stammer out a confused question. Looking deeply into her eyes with unwavering resolve, Gillis boldly confesses his love and declares his desire to become the knight who protects her. Completely frozen in absolute disbelief, a heavily blushing Shinobu internally repeats his dramatic words about becoming her protective knight. Feeling incredibly awkward and itchy over the romantic cliché, she frantically wonders why he chose her, while noting that such lines only belong in cheesy novels. Oblivious to her internal panic, Gillis smiles warmly and continues his sweet confession by praising her as the most earnest and lovely person he has ever met. As Gillis praises her unyielding smile through hard times, Shinobu questions if he is really talking about her, while feeling her heart brightly illuminated by his words. Laughing nervously, Shinobu tries to deflect the compliment by telling Gillis that he is praising her way too much. Staring intensely into her eyes, Gillis firmly declares that he wants to be her lover and clarifies that his statement is neither a compliment nor a joke. Completely stunned by the sudden confession, Shinobu freezes in wide-eyed silence and only manages to let out a faint murmur. Flustered and filled with apologies, she frantically explains that she lacks the mental capacity for romance because she is busy just trying to learn her job every day. Her panicked rambling is abruptly cut short as he steps closer and gently clasps her trembling hands in his own. Refusing to be brushed off, he leans in and earnestly begs her to please think his confession over carefully. Reassuring her, he promises not to rush her for an answer right before Julian unexpectedly interrupts to ask if she saw Gillis. Offering a breathtakingly tender smile, Gillis softly admits that he would be incredibly happy if she could think about him even just a little. Even though the Academy Festival is finally over, Shinobu's daily life in the assistant division remains chaotic as a florist loudly announces a delivery. Thoroughly confused by the sudden arrival of a beautiful bouquet, Shinobu signs the receipt while wondering exactly who it is from. Realizing her mistake, she discovers that the mysterious sender's name is actually written right there on the attached card. Blankly wondering if it is her birthday or some special occasion, she holds the card tightly, while the florist cheerfully wishes her a wonderful day. She practically shrieks in utter disbelief upon turning the card around and reading, "With love, Harold Gillis," written in beautiful continental script. Terrified that his ruthless fan club might hear them, she frantically slaps a hand over her mouth and darts her eyes around the room in pure panic. Observing her panic with a lukewarm gaze, an older gentleman playfully teases the situation as a youthful romance while calling out to Theo. Begging him not to say such scary things, she quickly locks the dangerous card in a drawer, knowing full well she won't get off easy if the other girls find out. Appreciating the bouquet's soft colors and subtle scent, she finds a suitable vase to display it perfectly on her desk so the precious flowers won't wilt. However, she quickly realizes that she doesn't even have the required time to let the flowers wilt naturally. Surrounded by a rapidly growing pile of daily bouquets, she desperately hides the dangerous cards bearing Gillis's name to avoid the absolute wrath of his admirers. Gillis's relentless romantic offensive escalates as he casually drops by at closing time to walk her home and pretends it's a sheer coincidence when joining her at the cafeteria. Cornering her in an empty classroom, Gillis playfully shushes her and affectionately notes that she looks incredibly busy. She stammers that she was just finishing up a task, already annoyed and fully aware that Julian spilled everything to him once again. Feeling overwhelmed by how strongly Gillis is coming on, she nervously reminds him that they just met at lunch, but he smoothly replies that he simply wanted to see her. He gently cups her hands against his chest, pulling her completely into his intoxicating orbit with a warm, affectionate demeanor. Staring deeply and sincerely into her eyes, he confesses that he wants to see her even more because it is genuinely fun talking to her. Questioning if she actually said something funny, she silently wonders why she feels an unexpected sense of relief instead of just feeling lucky to be pursued by such a handsome man. Struck by his melting, dazzling smile, Shinobu's heart flutters as she finally realizes that this person is truly in love with her. Snapping back to reality in a completely different conversation, Shinobu bluntly asks what exactly is wrong with Gillis. Utterly shocked that Professor Rosenstiel is actually making small talk before the start of their basic magic class, she asks him what he means by his question. The professor keenly observes that while Gillis's excellent performance remains unchanged, he now leaves quickly after lectures without asking questions, indicating his desire to learn is directed elsewhere. Realizing her intense desire to learn is directed solely at him, the professor stares in quiet contemplation. He notes it would be a waste to ruin such a capable student and seriously considers taking Gillis on as an apprentice. Leaning in with an intimidating glare, he firmly demands she tell him what she knows. Sweating under his heavy pressure, she struggles to explain that this sickness is just a common occurrence among young people. She attempts to summarize the long and short of the situation by reflecting on her busy daily routine. Emery finds the situation suspiciously difficult to believe, wondering why on earth Gillis would choose him out of everyone else. She awkwardly agrees it makes no sense, noting her own brain is packed far too tight with classes to comprehend it. Declaring the conversation over, Emery demands a quick decision for Gillis's sake, while she frantically begs him to keep it a secret. During basic magic class, Emery instructs her to concentrate on reciting beautiful verses for a beginner fire spell. She confidently recites the incantation, but a sudden flash of brilliance sparks wildly from her hand. Panic sets in as the explosive spell eats her magic, leaving her completely unable to control the surging flames. Her entire body freezes in the absolute terror of death as the blazing fire threatens to consume her. Suddenly, cool black fabric covers her vision, while a low, smooth voice tickles her ear and commands her to breathe. Secured beneath his heavy coat, she takes a breath and feels her magic return to normal as the turmoil subsides. Emery urgently asks if she is hurt while she stares in blank shock at her completely unburned arm. Noting the shattered crystal, Emery sighs in relief that the protective talisman came in handy right away. She stares at the broken pieces in her palm, quietly amazed that the magic circle actually worked. Emery gently chides her carelessness while she timidly apologizes for the runaway magic. He explains that his robe effectively suppressed the magic discharge, making it incredibly lucky he shielded her with it. Closing her eyes, she silently admits she cannot complain about the situation since he literally just saved her life. Still wrapped tightly in his arms, she nervously whispers that people might wildly misunderstand if they see them like this. Right on cue, Lady Sophie's furious maid bursts into the room and immediately brands her a homewrecker. Olivier aggressively berates the unmannerly pair, screaming that being alone in a closed room will ruin the professor's reputation. Lunging forward with terrifying speed, the enraged maid vows to eliminate the shameless woman to teach her a lesson. Emery's magically enhanced voice booms commandingly through the room, strictly forbidding the maid from harming his student. Shielding her on the floor, Emery explains he must personally teach her because her non-standard magical power poses a grave danger. Unconvinced, Olivier angrily demands to know if he makes a habit of intimately hugging just any student. Emery calmly shuts her down, explaining he merely used his protective robe to shield the girl from severe burn injuries. Lady Sophie quietly steps forward and pulls her furious maid back, confirming that the professor is telling the truth. Glaring coldly, Emery reminds the intruders that within the academy all students possess absolutely equal rights regardless of rank or gender. Lady Sophie gracefully takes her leave alongside her maid, apologizing to the professor for showing him such an unsightly scene. The professor watches them go with a tense expression, silently acknowledging her departure. Shinobu looks at him in disbelief, questioning if a simple grunt is his only word of appreciation for his departing fiancée. Recalling Lady Sophie's earlier gentle smile as she noted that Shinobu was simply the student who required the most care, the professor stands in conflicted silence. A few days later, Shinobu winces in pain as Olivier's lingering anger manifests into a new way to target her. Stumbling from a deliberate shove, Shinobu is mocked by a group of aristocratic girls from the accounting department who cruelly call her dramatic. The vicious gossip surrounds her, with the women sneering that both the professor and Lord Gillis only pity her because she is a mere clerk, and a traveler warning her not to let it go to her head. Starting that day, the daily harassment escalates as her documents are trampled and destroyed by those pulling the strings behind the scenes. Surrounded by bad blood, shoving, and insults intended to be overheard, Shinobu realizes that the younger magic department faculty are aggressively interfering with her daily work. Leaning back casually, Lord Gillis laughs off the hostility, joking that if he or the professor actually liked Shinobu, it would mean they had terrible eyesight or incredibly bizarre taste. Luckily, finding solace among the kind people in the assistant department, Shinobu tries to ignore the drama, recalling the proverb that people's gossip only lasts 75 days. Later that evening, Lord Gillis intercepts Shinobu under the streetlights, asking with a warm smile if she is heading home now. Startled by his sudden appearance on the quiet bridge, she stops and acknowledges Lord Gillis. She observes him curiously, noting that despite his usually strong demeanor, he is acting unusually timid tonight. Looking slightly ashamed, Gillis admits he heard that the women at the academy are treating her terribly. Groaning in total depression over his own lack of consideration, he hangs his head while Shinobu watches him panic. Waving her hands dismissively, Shinobu brightly assures him that worrying is a waste of time, noting that if they actually started dating, the harassment wouldn't end with just this. Unconvinced, Gillis laments that he is putting her through hard times, emphasizing that he wants to protect her since she came from a different world and is already struggling enough. Shinobu sighs over the women wasting their free time seriously interfering with her work, philosophically adding that she never thought she'd experience it herself, but acknowledges such things happen in any world. Gazing at her with earnest eyes, Gillis gently tells her that she doesn't have to put on a brave front for him, and that it's okay to admit when things are painful. Caught completely off guard by his sincere sympathy, Shinobu stares blankly and stammers that she isn't actually putting on a brave front. Reflecting on her situation alongside the professor and Gillis, she admits she feels very blessed, noting that not being able to return to her original world was far more painful than this petty drama. Smiling genuinely, she explains that the harassment isn't painful at all, though it does leave her feeling incredibly irritated. Faced with his deep, misdirected sympathy, Shinobu awkwardly struggles to convey that his assumptions are completely wrong. The seasons soon change, carrying with them an indescribable lingering misunderstanding between the two. Sometime later, Shinobu enters a room to find Lord Ludwig greeting her warmly, while the professor watches with a dissatisfied expression. Looking at both men, Shinobu internally marvels at the amazing handsome aura of the two people who protected her and helped her survive when she first came to this world. As Shinobu notes the professor's annoyance over skipped lessons, Ludwig announces he already told Emery, but there is a specific place he wants the two of them to go right now. Ludwig explains that while the Kingdom of Abend celebrates with a grand dinner party at the Venus Mansion, there is also an end-of-year winter solstice banquet that functions much like a New Year's countdown. Shocking Shinobu to her core, Ludwig cheerfully declares that he wants her to attend that massive banquet as the official traveler. Sitting back with a confident smirk, Gillis points out that Shinobu already understands why he is keeping her there. Gillis and Shinobu enthusiastically agree that a domain's prosperity is practically guaranteed by boasting about the incredibly useful magic and knowledge of a traveler from another world. Clutching her head in utter despair, Shinobu whines that as a commoner she just wanted to laze around at the end of the year instead of attending a noble's dinner party. Gillis sharply reminds her that she spent half a year agonizing over etiquette and dancing at the mansion for this exact reason. Flashing a handsome smile, Gillis informs a shocked Shinobu that since formal attire is mandatory, he wants her to go to the tailor today to start making a dress. Pumping her fist with fierce determination, Shinobu loudly declares that she will do her absolute best to repay their kindness. Professor Rosenstiel suddenly interrupts the conversation, casually telling Shinobu to take Emery along while she is at it. Shinobu furiously blushes and mentally shrieks at the absurd idea of taking the professor to the tailor, only for him to immediately clarify that his presence is not necessary. The professor sits elegantly in a chair and strictly calls out to Emery, making her jump in surprise. Leaning in with a sharp gaze, Gillis coldly warns Emery that she is greatly mistaken if she thinks wearing last year's dress is acceptable. Professor Rosenstiel solemnly reminds Emery that as a member of a ducal house, she needs to maintain dignity worthy of that name, so her attire isn't shabby at the banquet. He adds a subtle note of concern, pointing out that her family will worry if she does not look her best. Recognizing the weight of his words, Emery bows her head and quietly acknowledges his strict instructions. Watching them interact, Shinobu finally senses the subtle, awkward distance lingering between the professor and his family. She silently wonders what he is thinking, realizing he got engaged exactly as told just to reassure his distant relatives. A heavy, awkward silence fills the carriage as Shinobu rides alongside the brooding professor. Breaking the tension, Shinobu asks the professor if he meets his family often since the Rosenstiel domain is far away and they cannot travel easily without transfer slates. The professor confirms this, explaining that while some restrictions are lifted by interdomain contracts, transfer slates still require strict paperwork to prevent abuse. Shinobu warmly remarks that his family must be very kind to worry about him even when apart, noting that her own family was exactly like that too. The professor looks away with a dark expression, bitterly correcting her by stating that his family is likely just afraid of him. He bleakly reveals that his family fears the youngest child of the Rosenstiel ducal house will let his magic run wild again and cause another terrible scandal. Staring out the window, he confesses that his uncontrollable magic caused his older sister an irreparable injury that ruined her childhood engagement and forced her into a marriage against her will. With a desperate, heavy tone, he asks Shinobu if she really thinks he can return to how things were after creating such a massive rift in his family's happiness. Shinobu looks absolutely amazed and bluntly points out that he does not actually know the truth since he just admitted he never asked his family members directly. Irritated that she cannot just leave him alone, Shinobu boldly tells the professor that his lingering fears are just his own subjective view. She firmly reminds him of his past realization with Professor Wurzner, stating that deep misunderstandings only happen because he refuses to talk and ask questions. Glaring at him with intense conviction, she fiercely insists that he needs to stop hiding his thoughts and talk to his family properly. When the professor angrily calls her cowardly, Shinobu fiercely snaps back that he is the real coward for deliberately closing his own ears to the truth. The intense argument is suddenly interrupted as the carriage hits a bump, comically lifting Shinobu off her seat with a startled yelp. Smiling with a hint of genuine amusement, the professor turns the tables by playfully asking what she is going to do about her own situation after preaching all that to him. Staring intently at her, Professor Emery Rosenstiel sharply points out that she is the one looking away from the situation regarding Gillis. Emery firmly explains that calling it lovesickness sounds nice, but postponing her answer is cruelly causing Gillis to fail at demonstrating his true excellence. She argues she cannot give a half-hearted answer to a serious confession, but Emery harshly counters that she is merely making excuses to run away from the problem. Glaring defensively, she insists she isn't wrong despite internally admitting she uses her heavy workload as an excuse to put Gillis's feelings on the back burner. Confronted with his undeniable logic, she drops her head in defeat and realizes what a terrible human she is being. Softening his gaze, Emery rests his chin on his hand and quietly murmurs that he understands her dilemma perfectly. Walking toward the tailor in silence, she assumes he is being snide while he silently ponders something important. Inside the shop, an older tailor excitedly adjusts a stunning, custom-ordered dress on her, itching to show off his skills. The enthusiastic shopkeeper, Stefan, claps his hands and insists the professor must see the beautiful result. Peeking out nervously from the dressing room, she dreads the reveal, completely convinced that the professor is bound to laugh at her. Stefan proudly presents her to Emery, asking for his opinion as the professor stares in frozen, stunned silence. Assuming his silence means it looks terrible, she angrily yells at him until he snaps out of his daze and firmly denies it. Softening his expression, Emery quietly explains that seeing her in that dress simply reminded him of his older sister. A nostalgic glint fills his eyes as he recalls his sister wearing a very similar dress during his childhood. Putting the pieces together, she realizes the dress style was popular for young girls back when he was just a boy. Turning aggressively toward the mirror, she furiously stretches her arms out to inspect the fit of the garment. She furiously realizes the dress is designed without a corset, internally raging that he might be mocking her childlike, wasteless figure. Glaring fiercely at him, she stubbornly complains that the collar is far too tight and completely unwearable. Brushing off her complaints, the peerlessly handsome Emery smoothly counters by genuinely complimenting how well the dress suits her. Stepping out into the cheerful music, they admire the lively atmosphere of the week-long autumn harvest festival. Leaning in close, a female friend excitedly encourages her to go out and enjoy the festivities. Hesitant about her waiting carriage, she is quickly reassured that she can simply keep her ride waiting for a little while. The friend excitedly suggests she drag the professor along to the festival for just a little bit. Encouraging her further, the friend points out that the professor is perfectly accustomed to traveling. Stefan fondly remembers Emery's childhood, recalling how the professor used to visit the shop in winter with his master during his training journey. Closing his eyes with a resigned sigh, Emery agrees to escort her since his presence might help them avoid trouble. Spotting him waiting patiently with crossed arms outside the door, she briefly wonders if she should just leave him behind. Standing tall beside her, Emery prompts her to leave while she timidly double-checks if he is truly okay with going. Throwing up a cheerful salute, she thanks him profusely as he relays his master's wisdom about experiencing the world firsthand rather than just reading about it. Strolling ahead, Emery teasingly asks if she wants to hold his robe again, causing her to frantically decline and promise to be careful. Chaos erupts in the street as three rowdy boys run wild, role-playing with imaginary magic swords and barriers before crashing into a flower stall. Refusing to take responsibility, the brats coldly declare it isn't their problem and try to walk away. Springing into action, Shinobu angrily grabs the boys by their hoods and demands they apologize for their bad behavior. She fiercely scolds the worst of the brats, reminding them of the hard work the stall owner's mother put into growing the ruined flowers for today's festival. With a swift wave of his hand, the professor casts a spell that miraculously restores the crushed flower cart to its pristine condition. Staring in awe at the fully restored flowers, the panicked boys realize they are dealing with a real mage who sternly reminds them that playing dumb won't erase their mistakes. Looming over the trembling children, the professor declares that no misdeed remains hidden at the feet of the goddess. When the terrified boys frantically beg the goddess for forgiveness, the professor quickly corrects them, pointing out that they owe their apologies to the mistress of the stall instead. The crying boys properly bow their heads and apologize to the ma'am, though the professor notes that words alone are far too lenient. The surrounding crowd erupts in cheers, praising the cool mage for a job well done, while the local women promise to tell the boys' mothers about the incident. The grateful stall owner profusely thanks her savior, but the humble professor insists it isn't necessary and that she was merely lucky a mage was passing by. Refusing to let the matter drop because it wouldn't feel right, the stall owner enthusiastically tries to press a gift into the professor's hands. When the professor declines the reward, the cheerful owner suggests giving it to Shinobu instead since she bravely caught the culprits. Shinobu is caught completely off guard as she learns that girls are expected to wear flower crowns during the harvest festival. Gently placing the flower crown on a blushing Shinobu's head, the professor formally accepts the gift on her behalf. As they walk away together, Shinobu is left utterly confused when the stall owner eagerly shouts about the true meaning of wearing a flower crown at the festival. The lingering gossip reveals that if a young girl receives a flower crown from her lover and dances with him at the night banquet, they are destined to become a harmonious married couple. Shinobu's face drains of color as she mentally completely rejects the absurd idea of becoming a married couple with the intimidating professor. Glancing sideways with a slight smirk, the professor wryly admits that while he doesn't want to admit it, her exasperation is entirely justified. Just as Shinobu considers taking the embarrassing crown off, the professor suddenly pivots the conversation and declares that he should meet her and talk. Realizing he has been dwelling on their carriage conversation this whole time, Shinobu connects the dots and realizes he is talking about his estranged older sister. A heavy silence falls as he wrestles with his internal guilt, wondering if it's even possible to return to how things were after creating such a massive rift in his family's happiness. Staring wistfully into the distance, he confesses that this family rift was a painful problem he couldn't bring himself to touch for a very long time. Flustered by his sudden vulnerability regarding the precious older sister of his childhood, Shinobu awkwardly admits that she might have said too much as well. Offering a comforting smile, Shinobu reassures him by recalling his own words about how his sister was a kind, sun-bright person who doted on him and took care of him. She gently encourages him by stating that such a kind person surely wants to see him, reasoning that anyone would regret injuring someone so precious. The professor's expression immediately darkens into a bitter scowl as he coldly orders Shinobu not to say things just to comfort him. Shaking off the awkward rejection, Shinobu resolves not to lose to the professor's family drama, just as Lord Gillis warmly calls out her name.